Welcome, one and all, to this latest edition of the Future So Right podcast. I'm your host, Pete Beal, and this is a Green Flame Press production. I'd like to open today's show by thanking everyone who tuned into our last episode 2 weeks ago. I apologize for not getting an episode out last week. It was my intent. Unfortunately, I came down with a bad case of strep throat, so it just wasn't possible. Even now, I'm still kind of getting over it, but we're well on the mend, on the road to recovery. So we actually have a pretty special episode coming up for you today. We have a guest joining us today. We're going to be joined by book coach Katie Wall. Katie is the owner of Craft Better Books, along with her husband Andrew. Craft Better Books is a husband and wife team, and they help writers hone their skills and deepen their stories so they can craft better books. And they do this because they believe that powerful stories can change the world, and I think we'd all have to agree on that. To this end, they offer book coaching and writing resources for authors who want to write stories that really matter. If it sounds like I was reading that, I was ad-libbing a bit, but it comes directly from their website, which you can conveniently find linked down below. So make sure to check them out if you hear anything that you like today. There are a lot of free resources. They have a fantastic blog available, including they also have a free book available. And we're going to be talking about that today. So make sure you stay tuned. It's a great resource for anyone who's interested in publishing their work, but maybe they're not entirely sure which direction they want to go. As I said, it's a 100% free resource that you will learn about later in the show. It is also linked down below. So I think I've rambled on long enough, and I'm sure you're all ready to get to the heart of what we want to do today, and we want to talk to Katie. So let's get to it. Hey everyone, it's Pete from the future, and I just wanted to let you know one little thing before we really dive into this. There were some small technical issues with about 5 minutes of this podcast in the early going, and I did my best to salvage them for you. But in the end, Skype decided to make it sound like we were connecting to dial-up internet in the background, which was just lovely. And obviously, we weren't able to hear this during the proceedings. I discovered this as soon as we were done, and I went to listen to them. So I pieced it together as best I could, and after about 5 minutes, there's no problems at all. You just might notice there might be some strange gaps in certain questions and answers. I just wanted to give you a small explanation for that. I did my best to get rid of the noise, but at the end of the day, it just wasn't going away. So there were a few pieces I just had to cut out altogether. But overall, I think it's still a outstanding interview, and Katie did a great job for us. So please keep listening. All right, so I would just like to welcome Katie Wall to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us, Katie.
Thanks, Pete. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm excited to talk today.
All right, it's going to be a great time. Hey everyone, Pete from the future again. This was one of the areas where I had to cut because it sounded like I was a robot talking over a dial-up internet connection. So the question that I was about to ask to Katie was to explain a little bit about what a book coach is. And I promise this is the last time you'll hear from me. Enjoy.
Basically, a book coach is a cheerleader and an editor and an accountability person. And basically just someone that's in the author's court as they work on or they work toward their dream of publishing, and they work on their craft as a writer. So that's my summary answer there.
No, I think that's great, and I can definitely see how that can be really helpful, especially if writing, especially your first book, can be such an intimidating process.
Absolutely.
And sometimes it feels, maybe you feel your writing's going well, but you think, even if your writing's going well, where am I going to go from here? I don't know anything about this. And so having that sort of more experienced voice that you can turn to in those types of situations, I can definitely see where that's going to be very helpful.
Absolutely. And a lot of writers know that they need feedback. And so they might join a writing group, or they might have a critique partner or a critique group. Those are all potentially good things. And the reason I have that potentially in there is because sometimes writing groups can actually be more harmful than helpful, because just because someone is good at writing or knows writing doesn't mean that they know how to give constructive feedback or that they know
Yes.
how to really analyze what's working or what's not. So that's where a book coach can bring that professional lens in for writers.
Absolutely. With a group, you always have that sort of mindset that people have where they don't want to hurt anyone's feelings, and maybe they're a little too soft, or maybe they just don't read what you're writing and they don't
Right.
know what's good or what's not.
Yeah, or they bring in their own personal preferences instead
Yeah.
of trying to be objective about it. So,
Right.
yeah. And then, of course, if an author is aiming for traditional publishing, they can also hire a book coach to help them with their query letter, with their synopsis, with any polishing of the manuscript, and then also to help them form a pitch strategy. So a lot of authors will get so excited that they have this finished book and they're like, okay, I'm just going to like query every agent that I've ever heard of. That's not necessarily the best way to do it.
Right.
So a book coach can help you figure out which agents are a good fit, a strategic way to go about querying so that you can actually learn from the rejections you receive, and use that information to your advantage as you continue to send queries out.
So, what type of when you get into the process, when somebody say maybe they send you a few chapters, they send you a manuscript, how does that revision process sort of get started? What are the things that you're looking for, and what sort of improvements are you looking to make to those types of things?
Well, it really depends on what service that they've hired me for. So if an author has hired me to do a manuscript evaluation, for example, I'm looking at more of the foundational story elements. So I'm looking for if the story has a point and a purpose, instead of being scattered and all over the place. I'm looking for believability for the world, the story world, and is the world even logical, or does it fall apart? Does it not make logical sense? I'm looking for cause and effect. So, does this plot event really lead to this next one? And does that really lead to this next one? Or is it kind of just haphazard? I'm looking for character emotions. Like, are those on the page? Can I relate to the characters? And not in a subjective way, like, oh, that character's like me. Not like that. More of, does the character seem multidimensional? Do the characters react to what's happening around them? Or are they flat and unengaging? So kind of those big elements of story I'm really assessing in a manuscript evaluation. And I do sometimes, I offer that at two ways. So I can do first chapters assessment where maybe an author would not necessarily want to invest in a full manuscript evaluation, but they do kind of want to see, is the beginning of my story holding together? And, are there patterns in my writing that I need to work on and improve as I revise on my own? So I do offer that as a first chapter assessment. But so the manuscript evaluation, that's that global feedback, those foundational story elements. And as a book coach, I can either coach, I can coach writers as they are writing their draft or as they are revising their draft, and that's the ongoing coaching. But then I also the manuscript evaluation and some of the other services are one-time coaching. And so say I review their whole manuscript, then I would put together an editorial letter that is usually 5 to 10 pages long, with just tons of feedback. And then we have a coaching call to talk through that feedback so that I can answer any questions for the author and just really make sure that they are getting the support and the feedback that they need to make their manuscript even better. And so again, it just the process really depends on what they're coming to me for and on what their goals are. Because if their goal is to do indie publishing, they're not going to hire me to query agents.
Right.
Right. So
That wouldn't make a lot of sense.
no. But I do, whenever I have a new client come on, I do offer a free consultation. So we'll talk about, what they're looking for, what service might be best for them, kind of what my process is with whatever service they're interested in. And I have a questionnaire that helps me with a lot of pieces of information that I need to know going into reviewing their manuscript. And then I do often review a sample of their writing, unless we're working on like their story outline, because seeing that sample helps me understand where they're at in terms of the writing craft. And then it also helps me gauge, if they're wanting to hire me for one of my editing services, which is proofreading and copy editing and developmental editing, do I feel that their writing sample matches up with whichever service they are selecting? Because sometimes authors will say like, oh, I'm ready for a proofread, and I'm read their sample. I'm like, no, you're really not. You really need a developmental edit. And here, let me tell you why. You
Right.
always want to give them the why, because like, yes, this is my business, but I got into this business to help writers. So I want them to really understand why I'm making the recommendations that I am.
No, I think that's great. There's so much information out there online that it can get convoluted. And
Absolutely.
sometimes it's so hard to work your way through all of that information and know what applies to you and what doesn't apply to you. Like you brought up indie publishing.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, indie publishing versus traditional publishing, and how does somebody decide which direction to go? So, I think having a seasoned voice in your corner that can really advise you on different things based on your own particular needs is so helpful.
Yeah, that's the hope. And from what I've heard from my clients, they do find it really helpful. I haven't had anybody say, I regret doing this or anything like that. Everybody's always like, this was such a great experience. I highly recommend this. I wish, everybody could work with a book coach. And I'm glad you mentioned the publishing avenues, because we actually have a free ebook on our website talking about how to choose the best publishing avenue for your novel. And I put that together because when I was on Instagram, in the writing community on Instagram, I kept seeing people, not really knowing, okay, what do I do? I've put, I'm finishing my draft and I don't know what to do next. And I'm like, well, it depends, like your next steps depend on what your publishing goals are. And so I just saw this need for this resource, so we put one together, and people are welcome to download it. And I think I'm not sure I gave you the link already, Pete, but I can send you the link for that.
Yes, and I actually read it, and I can vouch that it's really an outstanding read, and
Great.
it contains a lot of useful information that I recommend anyone check out. It's only about 25, 26 pages or so,
Yeah.
so it's not going to take all night, but I think there's so much information in there that I see the same thing that you do when you're out on social media, of people not knowing which direction they want to go in. And this could really provide a lot of valuable information that could help you make that decision.
Yeah, we try to keep it very accessible because, everyone is busy.
They are.
So, boil it down to the main points. And it's enough information that, if someone really wanted to know more, they have what they need as a basis to then dig deeper on their own. So hopefully listeners will find this useful as well.
And my favorite thing that you wrote in the book, and it was a 5-word sentence, and it's something that I think a lot of writers don't like to hear, but it's the truth, so I'm going to say it now. Your
Okay.
book is a product.
Yeah.
And it's something that a lot of people don't like to think of their work as. They like to think of it, oh, it's my art, it's an expression of who I
Right.
am. And that's all true. But when you come into the publishing realm of things, you also have to look at things a bit more realistically, at least if you want to go out and sell this thing to people.
Exactly. And even more so, well, in some ways, if you do traditional publishing, the publishing company and the agent will do some of that thinking of your book as a product for you. But if you're doing, indie publishing or hybrid publishing, as the author, you are also doing a lot of the marketing or all of the marketing. And so at that point, you really have to think of your book as a product completely, because if you don't, you're not going to be able to market it, because you can't, anything you market is a product, right? So
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. Very helpful. So you don't want to take your gunslinging Western and try to market it to 80-year-old women, probably. That's probably not the correct market for you.
Unless they like Westerns,
You
but
never know. You might find
yeah,
that one or two that really love
right.
it. But
Yeah, but finding that target audience is big, and it's amazing how many writers, they're just like, oh, I just want to write this story, and they never give a thought to, who is my target audience? Who is going to want to read this? And while I don't think writers really need to necessarily, start planning a story based around what the biggest market is out there, right? They do need to have some kind of awareness of, what, at least, if you are writing a story that is a specific genre, you should have some idea about who reads that genre and what their
right,
expectations are going to be. So that, people will want to buy the book and will enjoy it.
right. You don't want to hit the publish button and then go on next week and see 0 sales.
Right.
Because
Exactly.
that doesn't mean your book is bad. It just might mean that you're
Right.
not marketing it correctly.
True. Yep.
And the same thing with the traditional publishing realm. You don't want to send your manuscript out. Say, if you have a fantasy manuscript and a publisher specifically handles romance, that might
Right.
not be a good fit.
You're going to get rejected.
You'll get a very nice rejection letter. But
Yeah.
so when you're going through these, and you've worked with quite a few clients now, right?
Yeah.
And the testimonials are on your website, and they're all glowing. Are there a few common mistakes that you see beginning writers make that you would say in this form? Obviously, you're not going to be able to completely tell us
Right.
everything, but
Sure. Yes. I mean, I see a lot of the same mistakes kind of over and over. I think there are different areas or groupings of mistakes. So, I mean, there's what we were just talking about in terms of, not wanting to pigeonhole your book into a specific genre. It's like, well, but genres are actually a useful category for thinking about your book as a product, and then also thinking about, matching reader expectations. So I think that is kind of a mistake that some authors will make, is not realizing that some of these categories or other decisions or goals that they might have really do play a part in how they decide to write and revise and publish their book. And some of that is just ignorance, because, like you said, there's a lot of information out there, but there's also a lot of conflicting information out there. And so it's hard to know where to start. So that would be one area. Another area would be getting back to the plotter and pantser cons, I guess, is that, a lot of the time when I'm working with people who have pantsed their way through their first draft, they'll get to the end and they'll be like, I have this really fun story, but the story is all plot based. So there's none or little of that emotional level, that drive, that is really what the reader will connect with. So I have no problem with like adventure books that like are all about the plot, and there's less of that emotional side. But the problem becomes when you have authors who they want to write a compelling, powerful story, but they didn't stop and think about that before they just wrote the book. And then you get into the issue of when you go back to revise and you're like, oh, the plot did this, and this, but like the character on an emotional level, like, doesn't change. there's no character arc. And so then it becomes, complicated because you have an existing manuscript to go back and, I mean, you almost end up sometimes rewriting big chunks of the manuscript so that you have that organic character arc, that change in your protagonist. So that's a mistake I would see a lot with pantsers, is not taking the time before they write to really get to know their protagonist on that emotional level and have in mind that trajectory for their character. For the pantser side or the plotter side of things, excuse me, I think one of the things I see a lot is authors being like too stuck in how they want it to go. And so then they're trying to kind of force their character into this framework that they've made. And so sometimes the character arc or that emotional level can start to feel really forced. And this is why Andrew, my husband, and we really advocate for this middle road, because you really want to not to hold on to that framework so tightly, but you also don't want to not have any framework at all. You really want to have some of that basic framework in there for that emotional level, arc of change for your protagonist. So yeah, I think that's like some of the core issue that I see, where it's like, it really would have saved, those authors so much time and angst if they had kind of gotten that in order before they wrote.
Yes.
And, you can fix it. Like, we can work with it. It just does take, a lot of time and effort and thought. And sometimes it's really hard for authors to let go of something that's not working in their book. They're like, oh, but I wrote this beautiful book. And I'm like, it's not working. And so that can be pretty tough too. But, I always try and remind my clients, like, you wrote this book because you wanted to reach readers. Like, you want a compelling story. You want the best story that you can have. And so sometimes that means changing things. Sometimes that means rewriting things. And that doesn't mean any of that went to waste. It means that you were learning and you were growing. And, now we'll move forward, we'll improve your story, and you're growing as a writer too. So now the coach part of me is coming out. But so I think, again, the plotter and pantser dichotomy, it can be fun to joke about, but there really are pitfalls for both of those, I think.
There really are.
Yeah.
I think you're right that a good middle ground is ideal.
Yeah.
Because in terms of defending plotters, which I tend to lean more towards plotter than pantser, but I'm a little bit in the middle, you want your ending to work. And
Yes.
you want to feel like you're building towards something as you're writing the book, but you also don't want to feel like you're reading a script as you're writing your book either. You want it to feel fluid, like it's happening as you're writing it. You want to leave the room for discovery along the way.
Yeah, and I think, there's nothing inherently wrong with, like, I lean more toward plotting as well in my personal writing. And I think there's nothing wrong with having a detailed outline, as long as what's being considered with that outline is that emotional level character arc change. Like, you want to really think about, why is my protagonist reacting this way? Or, what would they do after this happened? And less of a kind of like, okay, I need to get them from point A to point B to point C, with like the more clinical, a strategic approach, I guess. Although there's nothing wrong with strategy either. So it's hard to pin down. But I would say, I think if a plotter wanted to write a really detailed outline, there's nothing wrong with that. But keeping that flexibility and keeping the emotional level in mind, I think, is crucial to allowing the story and your the word just went right out of my head. like your instinctual understanding of your character and your story, like that needs to play a role too. It can't just all be up in the logical brain, or it will feel kind of stark and clinical and just that like that plan, right?
Yeah,
Like you
you
could
don't
say
want that.
a script, yeah.
And one thing you said a little bit ago that I think is really valuable that people need to understand is when you make these mistakes during the writing process, some people's habit is to get really angry with themselves
Mhm.
or to get down on their book, like, "Ugh, this sucks. I'm just going to give up on this." And you shouldn't look at it that way, from my view. You should,
Yeah,
everything that you do is a learning experience, right?
exactly, exactly. And I think it is really hard for writers to, and I think this stems some from writing culture's obsession with word count. My word count goal is 5,000 words this week or whatever, right? And so then when you get to a point where you're like, oh, I need to axe this whole subplot, or oh, like I need to rewrite, these whatever 5 or 10 scenes to take this other thing into account that I changed. There can be this level of kind of shame that like, you know, I have to delete these words that I put on the page and now I have to like redo them. Does that even count? And I'm like, as a book coach, I'm like, yes, it counts. Like you're honing your craft. Like this is important. Um, and I see a lot of authors too, like new authors who are just like, oh, I finished my draft and I read through it once, making some edits, and like now it's ready to see the world. And I'm like, no, no, it's not. And that's not to say that like they're not good writers, but that's just to say that, just like a sculptor has to take time to refine the sculpture, right? Like we have to take time to refine our manuscripts. And, sometimes that means chopping some words out, or sometimes it means adding a whole subplot or whatever. So I think, yeah, it's really important for writers not to be down on themselves when their writing isn't perfect, because even, I mean, amazing writers like with classics that people read over and over and, will read for years to come, they had multiple drafts, they got feedback, they had to change things. So, I think it's, there's those rare unicorn writers, right, who can just pound out a story and it really works and they don't have to do that much. But the vast majority of us have to go through multiple drafts to really have a polished manuscript that's ready to go out in the world. And that's normal, and people should embrace that as like, this is fine and it's okay. So
There's going to be pain in the process as we
yes.
go. And you're right, nobody's perfect. I mean, Michael Jordan missed a lot of baskets.
Hmm.
And Stephen King has a famous story he likes to tell where he had so many rejections. He hammered a nail into his wall and he kept putting the rejections on them until the nail fell out of the wall, and then he went and bought a
Oh
bigger
gosh.
nail.
Yep.
Now, I'm sure a lot of those people that rejected him probably aren't feeling very good about themselves right
Well, right.
now.
Yeah, yeah, but that was a process he had to go through. And I'm sure as he was getting those rejections, he was refining his work and learning from that. He wasn't just like angry about it, like, oh, well, my book's perfect and they're all wrong. Like, no, you have to learn from that. And that isn't to say, rejections, authors can't take them personally, but they are a tool to learn from. So that is one of the things that I do when I'm helping authors with their querying process, is I do offer a like pitch troubleshooting package. So if authors are being rejected, we can take a look at those rejections. Are they form letter rejections? Are they personal rejections? Are they rejections after the agent has read a sample, or are they rejections after the agent has read the full manuscript? Like all of that gives information that the author can then use to adjust their synopsis or their query letter or even the manuscript to give themselves a better chance of being accepted by a different agent. So there's, I would say, any feedback, any rejection, like it's all a learning experience. And not to say that authors can't let themselves feel the feelings that they might have about that. Like if they're feeling discouraged, let yourself feel that. If you're feeling angry or hurt or sad, like all of those emotions are valuable, and writers should feel totally fine to feel those emotions, but don't make any decisions when you are in those emotions. Like don't decide to delete your manuscript because you're feeling discouraged. Like don't do that. So I think that that's something to remember too on the writing journey, is even when you're feeling discouraged, like it will, if you keep persevering, you'll keep growing as a writer, and your story will keep growing and improving too.
Yes. I think the most important thing to take away, don't do anything rash, like you said. If in doubt, step away and take time, take a week, and then come back at it with fresh eyes once you've already processed.
Yeah, I think that's good advice. And that is one thing too I see for writers when they're revising, is often they are it's really hard for them to take a step back and to take time away. But especially right after you finish your first draft, that's actually the best thing that you can do, because you really need to clear everything that you thought you put on the page. You need to clear that out of your brain so that when you come back and you actually look at it, you can see more clearly what is on the page. Because that's what your reader's going to see. They don't know what all is in your head of what you meant to write down. So I often recommend that writers take at least a couple of weeks after finishing their first draft before they come back and start their first revision, because otherwise you really don't have the mental kind of clarity or objectivity to come back and do a quality revision pass. So.
I agree with that. And I think about when you're going through a first draft, at least for me, there are times when I'm thinking to myself, oh, this is the best thing ever written. And there are other times when I'm thinking, this is a giant pile of junk. No one's going to want to read this. And in the end, neither one of those things is really true.
Right.
You have to distance yourself a little bit and look at it with fresh eyes. Now, I want to ask you about one specific thing, because I'm a fantasy writer myself. And I have a love-hate relationship with one particular aspect of writing fantasy novels, and it's world building.
Okay.
Now, in some ways, it's wonderful. You can immerse yourself in this fantastical world, and it's amazing. But when it comes time to actually create it and go through the tiny little nuances of every little detail, like I'm looking at my map of my fantasy world. I hate drawing maps, by the way. But trying to figure out the little details for each of these regions and when that works into the story. And you want to build that world without info dumping and things like that. So, do you have any advice for me or for any other fantasy authors out there that have that sort of love-hate relationship with world building?
Sure. So, we are actually going to, we're working on developing a course on world building specifically, and this will help writers do the actual world building. So that's coming, and we'll have a couple of different kind of units of that course. So if people don't necessarily feel like they need the broad overview and they just want to hone in on specific aspects, they can do that. But that should be up on our site in by the end of May, because we're still kind of working. We have to finish recording it, so it'll get there. And we're going to focus a lot on our blog and our social media during the month of May on world building. So stay tuned for that. Listeners can sign up for our newsletter on our website and get all of those blog posts in their inbox. But so I'm not necessarily going to dive into like the how-to of world building, because we could probably talk about that for 10 hours. But in terms of avoiding info dumps, I think for, as you were saying, it is really important that you, the author, know all of these details about your world because your characters are a product of your world, right? Just like we are all a product of where we grew up, our culture, and the level of affluence we have or not, the level of education we have or not, right? So all of those factors play a part, and all of those things are things that are really important to figure out in the world building process. But like you were saying, when you're writing a novel, you don't necessarily want to spend like 2 paragraphs saying, oh, my protagonist grew up so poor and, they had one shirt for 2 years and whatever. So you really want to choose the details that make an impact on your story. So whether that's something that you need to know for the plot to be logical and for that cause and effect to work, or if it's something that you need to know, the reader needs to know in order to see the depth in your characters, those are the kinds of details that you want to include. And I would say when you're doing the first draft, don't necessarily, okay, so I would say when you're doing the first draft, include more detail than you think you need to, but also try not to info dump. So this is where it gets tricky because you want to make sure those details get on the page. But try and put them in ways that are organic. And this is where people often talk about, show, don't tell, which it's thrown around everywhere. But I feel like a lot of writers don't really understand what it means because I'll see people, in Facebook groups, writing groups and stuff, they're like, can you read this paragraph? Am I showing or telling? And I read it and I'm like, well, kind of neither. Because the thing about show, don't tell is that it's not so much about the level of detail, because I feel like a lot of writers think that like it's a matter of how much detail they're including, but really it's about how the detail is presented. And so when you are telling, you're just stating. So like say your main character's name is Sally, and so you say, Sally was sad. Well, that's telling, right?
Right.
You can do the same thing where you say, whatever happens, and then you could say, Sally stepped back and covered her mouth as a tear dripped down her face, right? That conveys the same thing, but it allows the reader to be in the scene and to feel and see what is happening. Yes. And so that's where you are showing. And so that's where I think, with world building, instead of taking a page or two as your protagonist is standing on the top of a hill looking over a city to describe every bit of how that city looks, you could spend a couple sentences just to give like a impression of it. But don't, get into the whole like, and on this, in this area there was this, and in this area there was this. I mean, that's an info dump, right? Yes. Generally speaking. Instead, have your protagonist walk down into the city, and as they are passing through those segments of the city, then describe what the character is experiencing. And so that's allowing the reader to really experience those things. So I think that's kind of a huge point for fantasy and sci-fi writers, because you're writing in these worlds that are not our world typically, or they're our world with a magical twist, or futuristic. And so you really have to include all of those details, but how you go about doing that is huge. And the biggest thing is just allowing the reader to see things through your protagonist's eyes, or to see things as your protagonist is experiencing them, is going to help the reader feel that as like gain that information in an experiential way instead of in an informational way, if that makes sense.
Oh, it absolutely does. I think it's that fine balance. You want, think about how you feel as a reader. You want to sort of feel like you're there with the protagonist.
Exactly.
Like you're walking through that city and you smell the fish market off to the side or the vendors selling flowers, but you don't want to stand up on a hilltop. And over in that corner of the city, they sell
Right.
flowers, and over in that corner of the city, they sell fish.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. And it's great, as a writer, you do need to know all of those things, but um, the reader, yes, does want to understand that through the eyes of the protagonist and experience it with them.
Yes, that's what creates that realistic experience
Mhm.
for a reader.
Exactly.
All right. So, Katie, I have to ask you, is there anything else you want to talk about before we start to wrap this up?
Oh man.
The floor
Uh,
is yours.
okay. Well, I think we've touched on a lot of the core, what a book coach is. We've talked about how it's important for writers not to beat themselves up about having to revise or change things. We've talked about world building um, and also the freebie ebook. I think, I guess I want to emphasize to the listeners that, as a writer, sometimes we talk about writing as, um, I think often writers embrace writing as part of their identity, as part of who they are, which is wonderful. But I think it's also really important to consciously reflect on why you write. And the reason I bring this up is not to say that one reason for writing is better than another. I don't think that's true at all. I think every individual's reason for writing is valuable and important. But knowing your reason for writing will help you figure out what your goals might be for your manuscript. So, for example, if you write for you, like if you write just because you like how it feels and so that you can enjoy the stories that you come up with, you may not feel the need to explore publishing avenues at all because you've satisfied your reason for writing just by doing it. On the other hand, if you write because you have the dream of being a published author and seeing your book in a bookstore someday, you will then make different decisions about how you go about writing than somebody who doesn't want to publish at all. And so I think, people often talk about, I love writing, but why do you love writing? What about writing do you like? I think it's really important for writers to explore this important part of who they are, and so they can consciously be aware of what their values are around it and make those decisions. Um, and part of why I bring this up is because um, if someone values writing and values publishing their stories and their books, then they may find that they are excited about investing in their writing career or in their writing hobby by hiring a book coach or a professional editor, or by joining a writing group, or finding a critique partner, or hiring beta readers. So I think it's easier sometimes for writers to um, understand that they are worth investing in as writers if they've done this reflective work to figure out like that, oh, this is a really strong value of mine. And so I should honor that and respect that by investing in it, however that ends up looking for them. Um, and this is just something that's not really talked about in the writing community. I mean, we all celebrate writing, or we celebrate, the different, like learning different parts of the craft, or we joke with each other about plotters and pantsers, or, that kind of a thing. And that's all wonderful stuff. But I think one of the conversation pieces that's really missing is around this value level, and just being conscious of that and making decisions out of that, just like you would about any other area of your life. So yeah, just wanted to bring that up too.
No, I think that's very beautifully put. And I think you said one thing in there that I don't think enough people really say, which is it's okay to just write for yourself. If
Mm-hmm.
that's what you want to do,
Absolutely.
you don't necessarily have to write something if you don't want to write into it with the goal of being published. Or
Mm-hmm.
maybe you want to publish other stuff, but there's something you just want to write for the pleasure of it. That's okay. And I think it's a wonderful thing. And I think it's something that helps us grow as writers and grow as people. Not everything has
Absolutely.
to go out there for the world to see.
Right. And on that level too, um, going back to like the word count, on social media, that can become really a competition where, so and so has a word count goal of this, or so and so has a word count goal of that. Well, if that's a helpful motivator for you, that's great. But if it's not helpful and it just makes you feel bad, like at the end of the week, that like you didn't match up to whoever, or you didn't meet your own word count goal, um, you know, go back to that reason of, why do you write? And did you satisfy that, or um, did you find joy in that? And if not, then focus on that part and figure out what's going on and how you can shift your priorities so that your values are being respected by how you spend your time or your money. Um, it really, the word count stuff is a lot easier to talk about than values, because I think the values, people have to be really vulnerable to talk about their values or why they love something. And you don't have to be vulnerable. In general, people don't have to be vulnerable to talk about their word count goals, right? You might feel vulnerable
Right.
in saying whether or not you've met it, but yeah. So
That really resonates with me as I did my first NaNoWriMo this last November.
okay,
And I did hit the 50,000, but
congratulations.
I don't know if I'm going to participate again just because the word count goal, it's wonderful. And if that's what works for you, I think that's great. And that's what gets you working. But for me, it's like you said, I was focused more on how many words rather than the quality of the words.
Sure. And even, I have not done NaNoWriMo. I think at some point I might do Camp NaNoWriMo. It won't be this spring. It won't be in April this year, but maybe another time. Um, but yeah, like you were saying, when you're so focused on that word count goal, maybe lose sight of the quality of the words, or even just being able to enjoy your story and the characters because you're so focused on just getting the words down. So, it works for some people, but there also shouldn't be this pressure to participate in things like that if it's going to suck the joy out of the writing for you.
I was going through that story about a month ago, and I was thinking to myself, this is a pretty good story, but I didn't really enjoy the process of working on it because every day it felt like a chore. I'm sitting down at
Right.
my laptop thinking, I've got to go, 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 go. And it just wasn't as enjoyable for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if you're not enjoying the process, what are you doing it for?
Right. Exactly.
All right. Well, Katie, I've really enjoyed talking to you today. If anyone's interested in checking out Katie's services, I'm going to have them linked down in the description below. You can visit her website, her social media platforms. Her business is Craft Better Books. And on that note, do you have anything that you'd like to add?
I don't think so. Just thank you so much for interviewing me, and I've really enjoyed our discussion.
No, thank you. I think it was great. So, Katie, have a wonderful day.
Thank you. You too.
So, once again, I would just like to thank Katie for joining us on the podcast today. And again, if you're interested in learning more about Katie, her business, or the services she offers, all of this is going to be linked down below. Her website is craftbetterbooks.com. I also recommend checking out her free book, also linked below, How to Choose the Best Publishing Avenue for Your Novel. It really is a great read and a great resource for anyone who might be feeling a little bit confused. And it's understandable. It's a very daunting prospect to face for the first time. And if you haven't decided which avenue you're going to go, it can often feel, if you go to Google and you search for, should I traditionally publish? Should I indie publish? What's going to happen is you're going to get hundreds upon hundreds of results. And some people are going to direct you one way, and some people are going to direct you another way. And ultimately, the problem with doing this is that these people are making their decision based on what's right for them. But what's right for them may not necessarily be what's right for you. So instead of preaching which option you should choose to take, what Katie's book does is it presents you with information that allows you to make this decision for yourself. Ultimately, nobody else is going to be able to make it for you. You just need the right resources to help you make that decision. And I think this is a great one. Again, it is linked down below and it is 100% free. So please check it out. So with that, we are going to bring this episode of the Future So Right podcast to a close. As always, you can submit comments, questions, feedback, topic suggestions to my website, petebeal.com, also linked down below. Also, if you enjoyed the video, make sure to give us a thumbs up, a subscription, it really helps out. Also, if you would like to be a guest on this podcast, if you enjoyed what you heard today and think that you would like to take part, there is also a form on my website, linked down below, where you can submit, and I will get back to you as quickly as possible. In all likelihood, we are not going to have a new episode next week, but we will have one 2 weeks from today. So until next time, please stay safe, stay healthy, stay creative, and always keep writing. Thank you very much.